Hello everyone, my name is Exabu, and this is my overview of Panzer Corps II's 1945 Axis Operations DLC, which came out this many weeks ago, but in any way, it came out with a dozen and a half or so missions, and some of the vehicles we used to normally see in our favorite free-to-play tank games. Obviously the battles cover 1945, both historic and fictional, with a split between the two that started in 1943 and continues in 1944. And let me say immediately that I, for one, salute our new alternative history masters. In 44, the alternative branch was great, but you can still see a little bit of wonkiness, a little bit of creative searching. In 41, you can see this line of the campaign actually flourishing, developing into something that is actually head and shoulders above the historical branch, which I found a little underwhelming and maybe not challenging enough because all of the difficult objectives are not supposed to be taken. I mean, the base historical material is not exactly conducive to sweeping victories, but the fantasy part of the DLC is easily the best part of it, and I must say that 1944 is still my favorite of the Axis Operations DLC so far. A bit ironic since I haven't covered it, but 1945 has brought us incredibly enjoyable missions in India and a blatant promise of this absolutely potty story continuing. And you know, it's difficult not to look forward to getting some more orders from the ex-General Frederick Fuchs. And if you haven't guessed yet, I think the decision to create this alternative branch in these DLCs is easily the best decision made for Panzer Corps II campaigns, because let's face it, this is a very arcade wargame. Even with the updates that came with the Panzer Corps games, the Panzer General system isn't really simulating anything. General-like games, as I call them, which include Panzer Corps II in one, are not much more than playing with miniatures in a video game format in a fun setting. And now that the game has covered most of the war, at least in Europe, North Africa, Middle East, India, and now that it has done all of that, maybe it's time to ditch the pretense and just go full on imagining wild new scenarios and campaigns in this particular settings. Essentially what games like War Thunder and World of Tanks did. Do you get to drive cool Panzer IVs and Shermans and whatnot? Sure you do. But is it at all historical? Oh, don't you worry about that. There are games that do the history bit much, much better by design. Panzer Corps, come on, I want to see T-35s rolling in Rio and Tigers reaching the South Pole. I might sound a little sarcastic here, but I'm not. Panzer Corps is at its best when it tries to imagine things, and I really hope there's more imagining to come. 1945 has also confirmed my growing dissatisfaction with a particular aspect of the game's design, and it's the aerial combat. Given the high stats of some of the late war planes, and especially the mounting arms race between the designer of the campaigns and the insane cores that the players have accumulated, I've been increasingly finding the air war to be devoid of significant tactical decisions, as 95% of it boils down to send fighters, kill enemies, hope the enemy doesn't gang up on one of your planes and kill it, making you reload. And once the enemy fighters are dead, you just send Rudel in as this additional piece of artillery. There clearly are no rock, paper, scissors arrangements you see with ground forces. I mean, tank kill infantry, infantry kill AT, AT kill tank. But even beyond that, I wish the air war in the game was a bit, or even a lot more than just sending your fighters in, rolling a lot of dice to get combat results, and then spending prestige on replacements. I wish there was more decision space, like, I don't know, offensive and defensive stances for individual planes, or choosing different altitudes that make it possible for your bombers to avoid enemy planes and do their missions, or just outright give defensive or offensive bonuses, depending on what the enemy chooses for its own planes. It could also be a step towards realism and less direct control of the planes, with the players selecting the mission and the area for it, and the planes then doing everything automatically, and create these nice highs and lows in the course of the battle, as opposed to what we get now, which is mostly busy work and reloading. Obviously, the game is very deep into its life cycle, so it's very unlikely to get any kinds of significant design updates like this, even though there were some pretty far-reaching promises for ships ships in the Pacific. I must say that air war has been increasingly my least favorite part of the Panzer Corps 2 experience. And finally, this would not be a cracking video if I did not give any advice. So let's talk about some of the elite objectives in this DLC, another great innovation that came in 1944. And let me immediately warn you that in the historic branch of the campaign, the high command objectives marked with a skull are not supposed to be taken. Most of them are possible, but if you go for them, you are very unlikely to have a good time, so please don't. I think the hardest part of the elite objective in Operation Puma is to not accidentally take the main objective before it. My approach to it was to advance along the bottom edge of the map. It's not too well defended, and once clear will function essentially as a highway for your tanks. From there on, just advance north to take the elite objectives. I've found the bottom two to be slightly better defended, so just blockade them and watch out for the occasional counterattack coming from the north. I'm sure the Operation Wagtail Elite has not caused you any difficulty. Just use your destroyers to find the path in the minefield and bring plenty of fighters to cover your transports. Operation Feuerkartoffel is probably one of the more difficult scenarios in this campaign, and my approach here to first clear the west parts of the map so you don't have to worry about it, and then break through one of the enemy's defensive lines as you advance through that gap in the middle. I found the gap to be a bit too narrow for sending all of your troops through, so a breakthrough is probably unavoidable. But once you're there, Minsk is not going to be too difficult because its defenders, while very powerful, are completely passive, so just surround them and let them stew. You get plenty of time. The elite objective in Zahedan is another easy one, as you pretty much need to follow the briefing and send 3 or 4 paratrooper units to the south and take the coast, while the main force pushes through the desert. And as you clear the map, you can just leave the Karen objective in enemy hands and take Karachi first. I think the Vienna Offensive Elite is my favorite here. It offers a nice little puzzle. It goes without saying that you should bring lots of AT weapons to this one, and the lake kind of suggests 2 paths towards the objective. Don't deploy any units there on turn 0, by the way. And I found that taking both the paths is actually the answer. Send a smaller and more defensively focused force in the north. This is the more difficult path, so these guys will clear the area and bind at least some of the huge enemy units that are defending the elite objective. The rest of the force goes to the south because that area gives you a good airfield and, importantly, access to the edge of the map, which solves your supply problem. The forest hexes there also make it easier to push your infantry forward. And once you deal with the counterattack waves, just go in and take the objective hex. And this is it for Axis Operations 1945, and actually really wondering if there's going to be a 1946. And it would be fun to see where that fleet we found in India actually gets us. Cheers.